Greetings, welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, we continue where we left off last time, but we push the story forward. So, I'm about to go to college, and I'm excited to go to college because throughout high school, throughout the prior schooling, it was pretty much me bringing myself through school. Now, I don't say that with any particular, hubris or, arrogance. It was the truth. And it's the truth because, once, that aunt of mine in Brooklyn, in Coney Island, Brooklyn, had taken in my brother and I. She wanted to adopt us. I said no. And you might wonder why I said no. Well, came to find out, that this aunt was the one who orchestrated having my mother sent to Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan and having us sent into group homes and foster care. Whatever acts she had to ground against my grandfather. Of course, some of this background is in the previous episode. Nonetheless, we had our moments of tension because I refused to bow down to her, particular way of doing things. And she would try to hold things over our head. I remember, she used to talk very negative and bad about, my mother. And that for me, that's a no-no when it comes to my mother. And so, I used to push back, as young as I was in her house. And she used to always made it clear that it was her house. In fact, she used to hide, all the sodas, the drinks, and snacks inside her room with a lock on it and a key. And when she went to work, and so, whatever was in the fridge was, the bare minimum of that much. It got so bad, it sort of reminded me my first year in college when if you had roommates and you shared a small fridge in your dorm room or you lived off campus, particularly after the second year in most places, you would have to write your name, on your juices, on your food to say this is yours, that's yours. I had to do that, in this aunt's house. We had competitions about who can, get some of the orange juice, but without emptying it, because if you empty the orange juice, you would be in trouble. And so all these kind of shenanigans went on because of the sort of draconian way she'd set up the house. But once she told me that, she took us in, meaning my brother Omar and I, to get, blessings from God. And I looked at her, with a sarcastic, stoic look. I'm not sure she believed what she said, but I surely didn't believe it because, the way in which, this woman went about her life, it wasn't the thing that you do, from your heart. She was doing it because of her conscience and what she did. But whatever the case, her and I had it out in several moments. And then the final straw that sort of broke the proverbial camera back is when, I think I'd taken out some dumpling from the pot, for my dinner. And she came and started cussing as she usually does. She monitored the pot, kind of reminds me of the movie Antoine Fisher, when Antoine Fisher lived in that group home, with that woman and her daughter. That woman was like this aunt, and that daughter was, in a way, not the sexual way in terms of the assault on Antoine Fisher, but the sort of overpowering and control was the rule of her sons, her two sons, most of the younger one and the older one. And so, I lived in this Antoine Fisher-like world, with this aunt for several years. And it came to a head when she said, I'd taken one more dumpling than I should have. And so I took the dumpling up and threw it back in the pot. Went upstairs and packed, whatever belongings I had into a duffel bag. Took a cab, went over to my other aunt's house and, begged her to stay there for, a month or two, maybe three. And I got my own apartment, thereafter. I think I was my second year in college, right? And so that, moment was crucial because, once I got the apartment, I immediately went to the Bronx and got my mom from there and moved her into the apartment in Brooklyn. And my mom lived with me. I took care of everything, make sure my mom was good. And, I've been doing that since I was 10 years old, at least, if not younger. And so I continued to do that and take care of my mom, while in school. Of course, every break, every moment I got, I would come back to the apartment, make sure she's straight, food, healthcare, whatever it was, make sure she got that right. Because I came to also find out that this, aunt was the one who also, went to, some spiritualists, in Jamaica, some so-called spiritualists, a fake one, a woman, um, and got work done against my mother. And so her illness wasn't a natural illness. It was, in fact, an illness caused by, forces, malignant forces being, placed upon her. And it's strange the way it happened because I knew my mom, since she was very young. She had me when she was 18 years old, which means she was pregnant at 17. And being her firstborn. A firstborn has a way in which they know their mother sometimes better than the mother know themselves. And so, I knew my mom early on, and I knew the kind of woman she was. She was a hard worker, very intelligent, very bright, but she did not know men. And this, of course, led to me being born. My biological father is an older man. And of course, this, caused, her to be seduced by the games that these older men play younger women. And so my mother, having been seduced by this older man, led to my birth. And of course, that, created some tensions because of my mom. So I knew my mom, when she was well and in a state that was, natural. And I knew about her tenacity, her intelligence, her independent spirit, and her vibrancy. And when I saw that shift, I knew it wasn't something that was by natural causation. And so I had a feeling about it. But later on, I got confirmation that it was this aunt who did that. So for these reasons and many more, I wanted to leave that aunt's house. And of course, many of us, particularly within these African-based, that is African-descended-based communities and families, don't want to talk about the violence that occurs within our families, don't want to talk about, at the hands of people, that are supposed to be blood, that occurs to us. In fact, these are the people that have the access to us and therefore, can do the most damage to us. And so, this aunt was a major, influencer in me wanting to leave, her home. Now, recently, I had a chance to give her a call and let her know that I thanked her for giving me a place to stay. And I meant that because this is an important point that I want you all to take away, that no one is absolutely evil or absolutely good. And so in this world of morality and ethics, we try to take sides in terms of absolutism, but no one is absolutely anything. And so even as evil and wicked as aunt is, she did give us a place to stay that was a notch better than the group home. And for that, I'm thankful. And of course, I register my thanks, to her for that. Nonetheless, her behavior and her actions and her soul, her and I could not agree. And so I left and able to find an apartment. Mom and I went to school. Now, college was really, very important to me because it helped to give me sort of room to grow. I remember the first book I read cover to cover was Malcolm X's autobiography as told to Alex Haley. And of course, we now know that Alex Haley has actually deleted or removed several key chapters in Malcolm X's autobiography to give an image of Malcolm that was not Malcolm, essentially to suit or fit Alex Haley's integrationist, approach to, African descended folks living in the United States. And so that book, having read cover to cover, was the first book I read, from cover to cover. I didn't read that way in high school. In high school, I was smart enough to just read a few pages or a chapter write my book report because the teachers didn't really care that much. And of course, I got good grades, but those were not grades based on any deep studying or the like. And so when I got to college, it really opened me up because I knew I was intelligent. I knew I had smarts to me. And I opened up the world of books. And so the library became my best friend. I was in the library as much as I was in the gym, as much as I was playing basketball. I was, in the library, almost daily. And I was focused on one thing: family history. And this is really one of the pillars that helped to start this channel 2 years ago when it was called Powered by Ancestry, right? Because I began looking into, who are these people, this composite, right? This mass of ancestry, through whom, I've come to this world and through whom I'm a part and through whom have centuries shaped me in the world I am. And all this mattered because, I now know that back home, in the village, as I call it, that my family there, and therefore my most ancient ones, they're a family of healers. And so it's not surprising that I was born in here in this human world into a family of healers. Once more, for those of you who haven't been watching the earlier videos, my grandfather was a healer. My mother's side, my great great grandmother, her mother, and of course generations of people. In fact, it was my grandfather introduced me to, ironically, the same woman, the same so-called fake healer spiritualist, who did the work for that aunt against my mother. Ironically, isn't it? I was a small little boy then, and I didn't know who she was. But this world is so much interconnected that there are these slight degrees that separate our contacts, with people. Nonetheless, so I began digging into the library, looking into, which slave ship came to which port, in Kingston, in Spanish Town, in the northern part of the island. I wanted to know about this period under Spanish occupation, under British occupation. I wanted to know about the Maroons, which are some of my folks who are from the Akompong region, the western part of the island. I began digging, 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 but I didn't stop there. I began to do research among my family members, in Jamaica. My uncle, one of my uncles, had sponsored my first trip to Jamaica to do some business for him. And in that process, I was also, interviewing elders within the family, my grandmother's sisters, her brothers, and those people who are the oldest repositories of some information about the family. And I would collect all these stories during oral history long before I knew what oral history really was. And so my entry into this historical work, began with my family, as it should. And so this work was opened up by the sort of vista or the platform that college gave me. And that's what I tell a lot of my students, that college gives you time to think, right? It's an abstraction, yes, but it's an abstraction from the realities that allows you to plan out and plot out a course, through, this particular maze, or what I call the Squid Game. Nonetheless, college was also a place where I began to, transform, my body. I became vegetarian, later on a vegan. I began to interact with people that, had, similar values or similar minds or habits of minds. But at the same time, I was never a follower. I remained the same little boy that I was in Jamaica. I was never a follower. I never had any crew or clique. If anything, people really looked up to me. Really, they did. In fact, the college where I went to, they had this event, during the spring. Every sort of, I don't know, ethnic group you call it, had their own weekend. So the white folks had their weekend, which was Oktoberfest, which is just drinking, right? Beers and whatnots. The African-descended folks, people of African ancestry, had their own weekend called Black Weekend, right? And so I was crowned Black Weekend King, and there was a sister that was crowned Black Weekend Queen, just to show you, I was well known on campus and well respected. But at the same time, I was also a loner, very lonely. Because I really missed my mother, really missed the family that I knew, missed the food that I was used to from Jamaica. I missed a lot of things, and so I kept to myself even though I was still popular. So it was layers to me on the campus, but it really allowed me to to grow. And while on campus, I did a lot of healing work. I remember there was a health food store that I would walk to not far from campus, and I used to buy all these herbs, and I was the one on campus, at least in my dorm. And ironically, the name of the dorm that I lived in, which I was a resident assistant in as well, was named Shango Hall. Not surprisingly, right? And I was told later on in life that the Orisha Shango had been with me since my birth. And so it's not surprising how these things begin to fall into place. And so not only was the creator, or Father God as I call it, but also these spiritual forces that were with me since I was born. In fact, before I was born, but they were witnesses that were there with me when I was born, were still with me. And they're with me in the ways that were both concrete, but also symbolic. And Shango Hall was one of that, right? And so I sort of caught on to that and kept that in mind. I knew that dorm was special, and I knew I wanted to live in it. I didn't know why, but I knew it was special. I knew I wanted to live in it. And so came to find out later, there was a reason why. So these plots along my coordinates, were sort of mapped out, and I began to kind of listen to all along this spirit, that was always with me, guiding me. And so because I was a loner, because I stayed to myself for the most part, because I was my own leader, I never a follower, I had this guiding spirit that always kind of directed me where to go, what to do. And that stayed with me until I was 19. And 19 is a critical moment. Why, you may think? Because 19 is when, that young part of me essentially went home. And then one of the reasons why I went home is because, I decided to legally change my name. And see, it is something that I've said before. I need to emphasize it. When we change our names, we're not only changing names in the human world, it affects, our connection to the other world. And I want to be very clear. I don't mean somewhere out of space. I mean this particular world. So when I say world, let me give you a simple way to think about it. During daytime, 12-hour daytime, okay? Let's say from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., right? When light is out. In Chi, we call that adiache, when things can be seen. And so when light is out in that 12-hour period, that's daytime. That's the human activity time. So when we go out, we do whatever we do, and then we come home. And by 6 p.m., most people are at home or will be home, right? And so when night falls from 6, let's say from 7 p.m., right? Or 6:01 p.m. back into 5:59 a.m. in the morning, the other world comes alive. And so in Jamaica, for example, we would never sweep trash out at nighttime because the other world is around. We would never throw water out, the door, at nighttime because the other world is out. There's certain, sort of cultural understandings about that when that world comes alive. And by alive, I mean it's really alive, right? For those who can see and can hear, you can see and hear things that are there that others can't pick up on. But basically, they can't pick up on it doesn't mean it's not there, right? And so, I knew that this other world was very much a part. And so I would, for example, I remember I gave away my TV, and so for most of my college undergraduate years I didn't have a TV because I just wanted to be quiet. And this is when the creating God speaks to us, is when it's quiet, right? God hates noise, right? And in fact, spiritual forces and beings hate noise. Whenever they come to us and there's noise, they will leave. And so it's in this, ambiance, it's this presence, of nature. I used to wake up to, the crickets and the birds and just that beautiful harmony. That's one thing I understand about being quiet is that you hear everything, right? And so, I would hear things, and I would see things, both in my dream and in my waking state. I was never had a skill as a wood carver, but I was carving things out of wood because I was being shown what to do with symbols on it. And I still have that, this big staff that I carved, to this day, and all the symbols on it. I didn't know what they meant, but I was doing things through spirit, right? And being guided along the way. So I was this spiritualist, I didn't fully realize it on campus, where anyone in the dorm room in Shango Hall, had an ailment, they would come to me. So it was cold, chest pains, aches. I remember there's one young brother who had epileptic fits, and I remember I used to get some herbs and give it to him and take care of him and show him how to use them. And I remember a year or two, maybe a summer, not a year later, a summer, I saw him in Brooklyn, I think over in Bed-Stuy, East New York, going by the train station. I remember we chat for a moment, and he said, yeah, you remember that moment when he had epileptic fit, meaning he's on the ground just shaking hard. And I used to, from that point on, help to take care of him. And he remembered that, summer thereafter when we met in person again, outside of campus. And so I was this person, this herbalist, and come to find out that my family back home are herbalists, right? We work with the earth, natural, organic things, right? And so my propensity to herbs and plant medicine and soil and things of the earth, was baked not only into my ancestry, it was also baked into the kinds of things that I was getting into, but didn't fully understand why or how. But all along, these spirits were with me, God was with me, but that turning point was 19. When I changed my name, I changed the angle of my path. So I wasn't off the path, but I changed the angle of it, trajectory of it, right? I made it harder on myself. So as I was growing into myself, I began to essentially open the room for that spirit, right, of that character, which I talked about in previous videos, that came to essentially, they saw a vulnerability, much like a malware or virus in our computers. They find vulnerabilities and they attack it. And so he found a home when my true self, a lot of me, not all of me, went home, and so what's left of me, was now a fight between what's left of me and, of course, the spirit that saw something that they could take a hold of, and that's when the struggle began, right? That's when the struggles began. And even though there was a deep yearning in me to connect with my father, I thought it was with my earthly father, when it was not the earthly father, it was the other father, that I call Father God, that was yearning and calling for me, but I confused the two. And the reason for that confusion is that I changed my name. And so the clarity and the skill that I had was now murky, now cloudy. And so this is a very important, message and takeaway to all of you, that when you change your name, it's not simply something on a legal document that a judge signed off on, right? You are changing the trajectory and the angle of your path, and when you do that, you're inviting the spirit of someone who had that name before, right? The spirit of that, and they see something that they can find a vulnerability in you, and it's not of the most pleasant kind. These are negative spirits or demons that are hovering over the earth because they can't go home, and they find a home in your body, in your soul, in your spirit, and that becomes the fight, right? Makes the fight harder. That makes the path harder, right? Some of us never get over that. Some of us do, and so I'll pause the story there at that turning point at 19 and continue, a little bit more. And the takeaways I want to share with you here is that once more is that there's a very important takeaway from my experiences, and hopefully share with you if you're thinking about changing your name, right? There's something in the name you're given at birth, whatever it was. It's not for a particular, it's for a reason, right? And your name that you have at birth is the name that you are supposed to have, because back home it translates differently. And when you change that, you change the angle of your trajectory, the angle of your path. And rather than essentially going straight on, let's say, a particular route or path, you now have a detour. And that detour, some of us make it, some of us don't. The other takeaway is that, the violence that is within our families and our communities, we hold on to them. It's almost taboo. It's like talking, it's like snitching, right? Which is foolishness, right? Because it only essentially breeds more violence, intra-violence within the communities, right? And so doing so, the things between that aunt and other family members, these are the struggles that, that are there for us. But those struggles, of violence is not something that should be tolerated or should be, simply brushed over, as simply something we can forgive and forget about. Ultimately, I forgave her because my soul needed to forgive her for me to move on. But I'll never forget that, and I take that as a lesson for, how I treat my children and any other people's children. And so these takeaways and more is what I want to share with you. And we'll again pause there. Please share your questions, comments, and experiences in the section below. Until next time, stay well.